medieval priests guarded more than scripture. Not just confessions, but quietly forbidden things, 13th century charms, love magic, and ordeals. A parish blessing might double as a spell lakes were sanctified for guilt tests. Some clergy kept grimoires despite bans risking censure, while parishioners begged for cures, luck, and fidelity, even by sacrilegious tricks with the host. Picture a damp dawn outside a village church, a feverish child at his mother's skirt, a farmer whose fields have turned to dust, and a man shaking with fear because his wife's behavior looks like betrayal. They do not come for theology. They come for results. The priest stands at the threshold between altar and amulet, his hands steeped in scripture, and in the same words and waters believers trust to bend luck, health, and hearts. He must baptize a newborn, absolve a thief, bless a plow, and quietly, without admitting it, whisper countercharms and mix herbal salves. It is a knife-edged life canon. Law forbids magic, and yet parishioners demand miracles on earth, not promises in heaven. So the priest learns to make piety look like practicality. He keeps secrets the village thinks are holiness. A scrap of linen dipped in consecrated water becomes a cure. A charm tucked into a newborn swaddling is sold as protection. A handful of tansy, a sprig of juniper, a warmed stone slipped into a mattress, can mean the difference between winter survival and death. Some remedies are trial and error folk medicine. Others come from monastery texts or liturgical gestures moved to homes. The same man who recites the gospel can recite the right formula to staunch bleeding or coax a barren woman toward pregnancy. Words that sound like prayer work like recipe and look like ritual. Confession manuals and penitentials train priests in pointed questioning about desire, but they also teach them social diagnosis. Who needs penance, who needs exile, who needs a charm to keep a husband faithful. Parish registers and court oath show priests adjudicating disputes with sworn formulas that carry social force. At times villagers call them saints, at others they whisper that priests are magicians responsible for illness or bad weather. The stories are blunt relics weighing on altars, cures that shift disease, priests blamed for storms. Power attracts reverence and suspicion in equal measure. The consequence is practical. A priest's daily blend of sermon and secret keeps a village functioning when law and science are distant. He stabilizes marriages, mediates land quarrels, and supplies remedies that often work well enough to save a calf or life. That mix of faith, craft, and social labor is why medieval people trusted priests to be more than clerics. They were community engineers who balanced the sacred and the practical, constantly testing the limits of both scripture and spell. And when that balance snapped, the fallout was public, messy, and sometimes deadly, which is why those hidden practices mattered so very much for good. At dusk, the village gathers at the church door. A child burns with fever. A field has failed. A marriage hangs on a jealous whisper. The priest arrives with a bell and a book, a tin bowl of water, a sprig of juniper, and the pallid reliquary that everyone believes can make the invisible visible. He intones in Latin, sprinkles water, touches the brow to the crowd. This is medicine, prayer, and a little miracle rolled into one. To a canonist, it teeters on dangerous ground. By the 13th century, the law was clear. Sorcery and divination were condemned, and after 1215 clergy were formally barred from involvement in ordeals. Yet the everyday toolkit of parish priests stayed the same: relics, exorcisms, processions, blessed salt candles, and carefully voiced prayers. Those gestures could staunch a fever or sound like an incantation depending on who listened. The weight of intention was what people carried home, not the exact label attached to the action. Inside the confessional, the stakes were higher. The Fourth Lateran Council made confession an annual obligation, and with that mandate, priests became repositories of the most intimate knowledge in the village. Admissions of sex, betrayal, secret births, even whispered fears that might as well have been pacts with demons. The seal of confession wrapped those secrets in silence. The priest could neither reveal nor exploit them aloud, and yet he could act with them. He prescribed a poultice of tansy For a womb complaint mixed juniper, for coughs recited an exorcism. In the same breath, he blessed a plowed field. Popular remedies sat beside learned rules. Medieval households had remedies for cough and sterility as easily as they had prayers. People believed relics bore weight literally and morally, and a cloth laid on the altar could change a life. At moments of crisis, the law, the ritual, and human need overlapped into a gray zone where intention mattered more than form. A mother might whisper an anxious confession to justify a remedy she could never name aloud. A drunkard could seek absolution in exchange for spilling a rumor that threatened a neighbor's marriage. In each case, the priest weighed how much to heal, how much to guard, and whom to trust with the truth. Clergy could be venerated as healers and accused as magicians. Their social position made them indispensable and vulnerable. They navigated estate disputes and baptized infants, read scholastic tracts, and soothed panic with the same litany. What strange secrets did they hide? Not just dirty rumors or illicit loves, but a practical repertoire. Herbs, incantatory Latin negotiation skills, and the authority to turn a shrug into absolution. Those secrets lived in the open, and the hidden stitched into the fabric of everyday survival. They could comfort, cure, condemn, or conceal, and whether their secrets saved lives or bound people to superstition often depended on the mercy of a single priest and the desperate choices of those who knocked on his door at midnight. And the long shadow followed. Behind the parish church, where Pete clung to the air after service and light fell in a narrow saint's beam, a woman knelt with a cut and a child at her feet. The parish priest lowered his voice, not for Latin to the whole congregation, but for the margins of the book Longinus. Name and invocation, 3 crosses, the wound stilled. He pressed lint and whispered a bleeding charm that braided scripture with saint lore and a pinch of kitchen medicine. Tansy and juniper rubbed into cloth, because the cut needed to stop before a surgeon could be fetched. It worked sometimes. The woman rose with her hand bound, and a folded paper tucked into her apron. The 3 kings. Names above a cow stall to guard, having a satyr square scratched on the lintel to ward off night terrors. A strip of parchment, with the opening of John warmed on the hearth like a talisman. These were acts of survival, not theology. Holy water blessed with ceremony on Sunday traveled home in a pewter jug and found its way onto cradles, thresholds, and milk pails. The scribe's hand blurred prayer into charm, blessing into remedy. The priest became midwife, healer, and thaumaturge in one. There was a payoff. A cow, given a blessed name, slept through the night and bore a bull strong enough to sell. A fevered child cooled after a wetted forehead and the recitation of a familiar text. And there were limits. Sometimes the charms failed. A cow died despite prayers pinned above her stall. A bishop's visit could turn private practices into public scandal, and neighbors called the village's farcing acts superstition in the light of day. Seen up close, these hidden acts reveal a parish not irrational but resourceful. People and clergy blending scripture, herb lore, and household ritual to keep life going. They were small, improvised technologies of care, pragmatic, precarious, and when they worked quietly, miraculous. The tricks were scribbled between hymns and harvest notices, passed by nod and whispered with the same seriousness as a blessing. One winter, a nurse bound a child's fever with a linen cloth steeped in resin, a line from John, and a grandmother's memory of a sundown prayer. The fever broke, the child slept, and the room breathed easier for a night. When a recipe failed, neighbors learned. When it succeeded, it became memory. In that seam between doctrine and necessity, medieval faith bent toward care, not away from reason. These acts carried costs, risk of censure, the price of secrecy, the quiet erosion of trust when rumor walked the lanes as superstition. Yet the margins multiplied, a living archive of how life persists. Tomorrow's tale may turn from the margins to the rooms where care is made, showing what it costs a parish to keep faith and body in tune, even when each method sits on the knife edge between devotion and danger. Under the tremor of a single church candle, a woman leaned over her husband's goblet and dropped a crumb of the consecrated host into the wine. She told herself it was mercy a sacred knot to bind his wandering heart. He drank, kissed the rim, slept more faithfully for a while, and the neighbors said nothing. Because what else does a woman do when a marriage is the village's economy and gossip can topple a life? The act tasted of necessity and danger, mercy that could become blasphemy, kindness that might breed contempt, a private choice, echoing through the street like a rumor that refused to die. In another parish, a man came to the priest with a pocket full of fear and 3 coins for rent. He demanded the Bible be laid on a stone, a key crossed upon its page, and the priest listened for which way the metal would tremble. If it rocked toward one neighbor, that neighbor was accused. This was not law, it was hunger wearing a cassock, hope wearing a coin purse, and a community's desperate attempt to translate invisible wrongs into visible names. The ritual traveled through kitchens and barns as easily as a wind, and the priest walked a line between mercy, risk, and the crowd's unanswerable hunger for certainty. Outside the churchyard, a pond waited, small and foul, ringed with reeds. Someone had blessed it once in Lent, and blessing had become a test, find truth. The accused were bound, sometimes with ropes, sometimes with prayers, and thrown into the cold. In theory, the water rejected guilt, the innocent sank breathless, while the guilty floated, shoulders bobbing like treachery made light. In practice, the pond judged more than sin, it judged luck, lung capacity, and the crowd's willingness to punish. Bishops forbade ordeals, councils banned sacramental tricks, but priests walked the lanes among their flocks because legal channels often failed to quiet fear. These rites soothed pain and answered questions no court could touch. They turned fear into ritual and ritual into proof that life could endure. People begged for fixes, herbs and charms, prayers whispered in beds, small sacraments pressed into domestic service. Some remedies drew on long memory, others flirted with danger. Cotton root, juniper, tansy, household knowledge rubbing against clerical ritual. The cost was humiliation, sometimes death. A tied body that would not float could drown, and funerals followed interrogations. Rumor could make a priest saint in one hamlet and a witch in the next. Yet people returned with fears and coins because certainty tasted like survival. Midnight in the sacristy pressed in like damp velvet, and the old book answered with the soft rasp of vellum opening. The subdeacon's breath fogged the lamp, and the words rose in his throat as if they were not his but the thing waiting to be spoken through him. The text didn't merely promise memory or counsel, it promised leverage, the hinge between a whispered prayer and a life changed by it. He read the lines aloud, not for faith, but for an edge, a way to bind a restless spirit, or to coax a stubborn bishop into a favorable judgment, or to turn a shy sinecure into a fortune in a single election of favor. Literate clerics were told on doors that ordinary folk did not know how to pick. The Ars Notoria offered a perfect memory for disputation. The sworn book of Honorius swore angelic aid. The Munich manual mapped rites that looked holy but bent other loyalties toward the author's desire. The cost was not just discipline but exposure. Fasting until the backbone ached, confessing sins to a brother who would not betray you, midnight circles on cold floor tiles, syllables spoken with a precision that felt religious and reckless at once. To perform them was to chase holiness and hubris down the same corridor. There was danger, yes. The papal bulls and episcopal investigations that branded such things sorcery cloaked in clerical habit. Grimoire owners risked career-ending shame, exile, or worse. So the books became contraband, hidden in the hems of cassocks, tucked into hollow spaces in wooden chests, bound within the blank margins of bestiaries, or secreted in missals whose marginalia whispered forbidden knowledge to those who knew how to listen. Each manuscript became a peculiar object with its own sting, a page splinter, a dust of ash, a signature that could seal or betray. Why endure the risk? In a world where exams decided futures, patrons rewarded rumored miracles and rumors of hidden treasure wandered through mapped woods. The lure proved irresistible. Some sought only a cure for a fever or a sick child, others lusted for status, for a leap ahead of rivals, for a shortcut to power. And so, in the hush of the sacristy, they read, memorized, and sometimes crossed the line because scripture and secret text alike claimed the right to steer a life. The books did not simply collect dust, they shaped decisions, reputations, and destinies. Quiet combustibles in cassocks that could illuminate a scholar's mind or set a parish aflame. The temptation endured. For centuries it did and remained lethal. On a damp morning, a bishop's official rode into a parish, parchment in hand, and the whole village rearranged itself. The official's questions about charms, amulets, blessed bread kept under beds, and rituals for sick cows were not abstract theology but a threat to livelihoods. In the cottages, the hearths kept secrets hotter than talk. A grandmother pressed tansy into a cheesecloth. A young husband whispered that a charm might be cheaper than a cow's death, and a priest's own shelf bore vials labeled in Latin, some shared, some hidden. Priests were meant to be the thin membrane between ordinary men and God, yet many also hoarded practical know-how, which herb staunched bleeding, how to steady a stalled birth with a cup of tansy, which chant might quiet a nightmare or coax a lame ox back onto its feet. That knowledge, honed in kitchens and cloisters alike, could comfort a family through catastrophe, and it could cost a priest his parish. The clerk's ticking penitentials, questions as intimate as marriage beds, transformed living practice into evidence, turning life into boxes to be checked or boxes to be paid for. There are recorded panics, a priest accused of weaving love magic around the host, turning the sacrament into a talisman. For lust, a failed exorcism that branded its performer as unfit for ministry. For years, small cures that required cash and risked larger accusations of heresy. People paid for cures and paid again with suspicion. Penitentials trained priests to pry into the most intimate acts, so clergy knew secrets they kept to preserve reputations, marriages, and the fragile social fabric. They also kept recipes for cures, toxins and tonics once common in households, so secrecy was a form of practical power. The fear was not merely eternal damnation, but losing place in a village economy. A charm cost more than silver, it cost a reputation, a livelihood, a family's ability to belong. During episcopal visitations, clerks ticked boxes from standardized penitentials, questions as personal as marriage beds, transforming lived practice into evidence. Gregory VII had to protest when priests were accused of causing storms or infections, a reminder clerical magic could be reviled as readily as revered. Manuscripts and recipe books were guarded like family silver, passed from hand to hand, and when a grudge found a curious ear, those remedies could become lethal testimony. Power sat on a razor. When a charm worked, it stitched a community back together. When it failed or a rival gossiped, the same tools kindled witch hunts or sacrilege trials. Secrets protected communities until they burned them, and the quiet economy of healing and harm moved through kitchens, cloisters, and pews, ready to endure another visit, another verdict, another night. Even at the coldest hours, the castle kept a stubborn pulse of warmth, a private ledger of heat that circulated from kitchens to bedchambers like a narrow river through stone. The bedchamber, curtains drawn tight, was not a sanctuary, but a workshop, wool and fur piled into a cocoon, the four-poster raised on feet of oak to keep drafts from crawling beneath the sheets, heat stored in bricks and hot stones tucked between blankets, as if the bed itself were a stove you slept in. A servant would wake hours before the Lord, coaxing the brazier to life, warming stones, boiling water to pour into ceramic jars, then folding the warmth into linen sacks that hissed softly under the sheets. Wealth bought extras, felted blankets, extra coverlets, and the quiet arithmetic of sharing a bed or two to stretch the warmth farther. Yet warmth was not free, it was a social contract hammered out in corridors and staircases. The night watch learned to move, stamping or rubbing their gloved hands, until the chill loosened its grip. If fatigue won, the penalty could be swift. Lose coin, miss a day of meals, or be told that fuel would be cut for the rest of the season. The kitchen kept the brazier fed, while lower dormitories slept with gnawing teeth, and the sense that the castle ran on the backs of those who carried heat and risk. Some nights the master's bed breathed with hot stones, and a shallow pool of wine warmed by a copper brazier. Other nights, the room held only the memory of warmth and the ache of a cold stone floor. And beyond the curtains, the house slept to a slower, heavier clock, the policy of the great house building its own weather inside the walls. Then came the real cost, the quiet economies and tiny acts that made survival possible. Servants kept watch all night, shuttling coals, stacking bundles of wool to line doors, sharing a blanket, swapping a bed with a child or a scholar, so the young would not freeze. The nobility grew wary of waste, hoarding fuel, rationing light, while the masons' guild argued over window size, and the blacksmith argued with the forester over wood, because every extra log mattered when winter pressed in. And when guards paced the parapets, they did more than guard. They kept the silence of a castle from breaking into a deadly cold. In those small, stubborn choices, the cold made its politics: who slept where, who kept the last fire, who kept faith with others when the winter wore them thin. The lesson traveled with the dawn. Survival is a net woven from warmth, labor, and trust, and that is how the story will carry us forward.